They swore oaths, wore flags, gave speeches about freedom, then signed orders that killed thousands. Some massacred, some enslaved, some smiled through it. History calls them complicated. We call them presidents. But what if evil doesn't march in jackboots? It walks the White House halls in tailored suits. This isn't about scandals. It's about the men who broke the country and called it leadership. So buckle in. We're not ranking who was worst. We're asking who wore evil best. Andrew Jackson. There are American presidents you forget, and then there's Andrew Jackson, etched into currency, school textbooks, and the scar tissue of a nation. He's the man whose face still smirks from the $20 bill, as if daring you to ask what he did to get there. Jackson didn't inherit the presidency. He seized it. With a general's swagger and a populist snarl, he strutted into the White House like a warlord dressed up for a state dinner. And unlike most politicians, he didn't pretend to be civilized. He liked his whiskey unfiltered, his enemies broken, and his policies soaked in blood. They called him Old Hickory, a nickname that somehow made cruelty sound homespun. But you don't get called King Andrew by accident, and you don't earn a legacy like his without leaving bodies behind. Let's begin with the most polite name for genocide ever passed through Congress, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson didn't invent it, but he signed it with a grin. He pitched it as necessary, rational, even benevolent. He spoke of protecting Native Americans from extinction, as if exile was a form of kindness. The result was forced migration, starvation, exposure, and mass death. The most infamous journey? The Trail of Tears. But there were many trails, and they all ended in graves. Tens of thousands were marched west like cattle, their homes torched behind them. Entire cultures were uprooted by bureaucratic ink and military steel. In his 1830 address to Congress, Jackson claimed this policy would perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government, and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits, as if they were being upgraded, as if being herded at gunpoint into foreign lands was an act of modernization. One wonders what Jackson saw when he looked at a Cherokee child coughing up blood in the cold. A necessary casualty? A savage too slow to move? Or nothing at all? Jackson framed it all as progress. White settlers called it destiny. Historians would later call it ethnic cleansing. But the name on the signature line was Andrew Jackson, and he signed with pride. He didn't do it in secret either. It was a spectacle of power. He leveraged his popularity like a weapon, dared Congress to resist him, and used the law like a battering ram. He was elected as a man of the people and then used that mandate to obliterate the people who weren't white, wealthy, or willing to play along. Democracy for some, eviction for the rest. And it worked, because Jackson wasn't some rogue lunatic. He was popular. He didn't break the system, he was the system. He just used it more aggressively than anyone else dared to. But mass displacement wasn't Jackson's only crusade. He had other enemies, banks. Or more precisely, any institution that limited his authority. The Second Bank of the United States had survived political storms for decades. Jackson took it personally. He viewed it as a nest of privilege and corruption, a financial monarchy standing between him and his vision of a frontier republic. So, he killed it. He vetoed the bank's recharter with biblical fury, calling it unconstitutional and dangerous. Then he yanked federal deposits and threw them into local pet banks, many of them operated by his loyalists. The economy surged for a little while. Then came inflation, speculation, and a crash. The Panic of 1837 detonated after he left office, but the fuse was lit under his desk. Thousands lost their savings. Businesses collapsed. Workers starved. Jackson, comfortably retired, never seemed to notice or care. This is the strange duality of Jackson. He claimed to fight for the common man while implementing policies that eventually crushed them. He warned against centralized power while consolidating it in himself. He preached liberty while enforcing oppression, and somehow it made him more beloved. He vetoed more bills than all 6 presidents before him combined. He laughed off the Supreme Court, especially after they ruled in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester versus Georgia. His alleged response? John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The line might be apocryphal, but the attitude was real. He believed in the will of the people, but only if the people agreed with him. Jackson didn't see checks and balances as safeguards. He saw them as inconveniences. And so, piece by piece, He disassembled the parts of government that slowed him down. He turned the presidency into a throne and ruled like a man who thought democracy was a polite synonym for personal conquest. His critics called him tyrannical, but he wore that critique like armor. The more elites hated him, the more the masses cheered. He was the country's first populist strongman, equal parts celebrity and executioner. He fought duels, dozens by some estimates. He killed a man for insulting his wife. He carried bullets in his chest until the day he died. He was violence in human form, wrapped in patriotic bunting, and yet he was loved. There's something especially chilling about that, because Jackson didn't deceive anyone. He didn't hide his brutality. He put it on stage and dared the nation to flinch, and the nation applauded. Which brings us to the central mystery of Jackson. Was he evil, or was he just American? Did he embody something dark and aberrant, or was he the distilled essence of what the country wanted to be at the time? He was both the symptom and the disease. A man who built democracy with one hand and torched it with the other. A president who expanded voting rights for poor white men while orchestrating mass death for everyone else. A hero to many, a monster to millions. Today, we teach children about his military victories. We point to his image on our money. We name cities and schools after him. The Trail of Tears remains a footnote. A tragic necessity, some still argue. A hard decision, a product of its time. As if time ever pulled the trigger. Andrew Jackson didn't just commit atrocities. He normalized them. He turned genocide into policy and called it governance. He paved the road for centuries of institutional cruelty by proving it could be done with a smile and a flag. And in doing so, he left a legacy far more dangerous than any battlefield victory. He taught America how to look evil in the eye, salute it, and vote for it anyway. Now, if you think that's the darkest chapter, if you think the federal government couldn't possibly get more oppressive, more racially venomous, or more deluded about its own virtue, well, let's fast forward to a president who quoted the Bible, preached progress, and segregated the entire federal workforce. And who screened a Klan movie in the White House? Woodrow Wilson, the man who ran for re-election on the promise that he kept us out of war, is also the man who dragged the country into one, while silencing anyone who dared to say no. Woodrow Wilson didn't wear tyranny like a saber-rattling general or a whiskey-soaked populist. He wore it like a scholar, polished, polite, sanctimonious, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. If Andrew Jackson made brutality look patriotic, Wilson made it look presidential. Born in Virginia and raised in the Confederacy's long shadow, Wilson brought his genteel Southern sensibilities all the way to Princeton, then the White House. He wasn't just a politician, he was an academic, a professor, a man who read the Constitution like scripture and interpreted it like prophecy. But what he saw in America wasn't freedom, it was hierarchy, order, a nation divided not by accident, but by divine design. And he had no problem enforcing that order. Let's begin with race. It's easy to forget, partly because we're encouraged to, that before Wilson arrived, Washington, D.C.'s federal offices were already beginning, slowly and unevenly, to integrate. Black Americans worked in the civil service. They sat at desks next to white clerks. They drew salaries from the same treasury. It wasn't equality, not even close, but it was a beginning. Then came Wilson. Under his administration, federal departments resegregated. Black workers were physically separated, demoted, or dismissed. Bathrooms and cafeterias were divided. Some black clerks found literal cages erected around their desks, separating them from their white co-workers like animals in a bureaucratic zoo. Wilson's rationale, he said integration had been a mistake, and that segregation would reduce friction. He wasn't enforcing racism, he claimed. He was preserving harmony, but harmony in Wilson's universe meant silence, especially from those suffering. In 1913, civil rights leader William Monroe Trotter met with Wilson to protest these policies. Trotter, a Harvard graduate, editor, and activist, was met not with debate, but disdain. When he refused to moderate his tone, Wilson ended the meeting, offended that a black man would dare to speak so directly in the Oval Office. So, yes, Wilson resegregated the government, but that wasn't the scandal. The scandal was how calmly he did it, and that calm cruelty reached its peak not in office cubicles, but in a darkened theater inside the White House. It was 1915. The film was The Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour silent epic glorifying the Ku Klux Klan as saviors of the South and demonizing Black Americans as violent predators. It was the first film ever screened at the White House. Wilson reportedly said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." That quote has been debated, but the film screening happened, and so did the silence afterward. No apology, no clarification, just flickering images of hooded men burning crosses, endorsed, if not in words, then in silence, by the President of the United States. Wilson didn't just believe in white supremacy. He intellectualized it, justified it, wove it into the moral fabric of his governance like it was common sense. He wasn't a rogue racist. He was the system's favorite son. But if that were all, if Wilson's evil stopped at segregation and silence, perhaps history would have filed him away as just another old white man with a fragile ego. Unfortunately, he kept writing. When the United States finally entered World War I in 1917, Wilson told the nation it was to make the world safe for democracy. But at home, democracy got locked in a trunk and buried under the Espionage Act. That law and its even more draconian offspring, the Sedition Act of 1918, made it a crime to disloyally criticize the government, the Constitution, or the military. Americans were arrested for handing out anti-war leaflets, for giving speeches, for writing editorials. One man received a 10-year sentence for saying the war benefited capitalists. Free speech apparently wasn't safe for democracy. Eugene V. Debs, socialist, pacifist, presidential candidate, was sentenced to prison for condemning the draft. He ran for president in 1920 from his cell. He still pulled nearly 1 million votes. Wilson's administration arrested thousands. Newspapers were censored. Books were banned. And all of it was done in the name of loyalty. He didn't jail traitors, he jailed critics. Wilson didn't use brute force like Jackson. He used bureaucracy. He made repression feel official, procedural, justified. He didn't scream, he whispered, and the Constitution trembled all the same. But here's the twist. Even as he crushed dissent at home, Wilson dreamt of world peace. He envisioned a grand post-war order led by his League of Nations, where diplomacy replaced warfare and nations behaved like gentlemen. It was utopian, idealistic, and catastrophically arrogant, because Wilson's dream only worked if everyone agreed to play by his rules. At the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, he brushed aside European cynics and declared that a new world order was possible. He called it the 14 Points, but behind closed doors, he compromised nearly every one of them to placate the British and the French. Colonialism, left intact. Punitive reparations for Germany, approved. Self-determination, for white nations only. His League of Nations passed in Europe, but at home the Senate rejected it. The irony? Wilson, the great suppressor of domestic dissent, now needed Congress's permission. And for once, he didn't get it. The same man who'd silenced his critics couldn't silence his own legislature. The League died in the Senate chamber. Wilson's vision of a peaceful world collapsed, and so did he, literally. A stroke incapacitated him for the final year and a half of his presidency. His wife, Edith, essentially ran the executive branch in secret. It was the most undemocratic administration in modern memory, and it ended as it had governed, behind closed doors, guarded by a soft voice and a harder hand. And yet, even now, some hail Wilson as a progressive icon, a reformer, a visionary. Yes, he signed the Federal Reserve into existence. Yes, he passed labor laws and reined in monopolies. But his reforms were surgical. His repression was total. He widened the road for white workers and burned the bridges behind them. The deeper mystery of Wilson isn't just what he did, it's how easily we forgot it. How quickly the scholarly accent and the eloquent speeches drowned out the prison sentences and segregation orders. He made tyranny look like administration, and America nodded along. But if Wilson was the scholar who locked down liberty in a three-piece suit, the man who came next was something else entirely. A rough-cut replacement president with no vision, no allies, and no interest in black freedom. Where Wilson resegregated federal offices, this next man tried to re-enslave the entire post-war South. A man who rose to power on the back of an assassin's bullet and spent the rest of his time trying to kill the dream of emancipation. Andrew Johnson. Some men become president by ambition, Andrew Johnson became president by accident. He wasn't elected to lead. He stumbled into the Oval Office after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, dragged into the highest office of the land by a fluke of history and a pistol's crack. It was April 1865. The war was over. The country was on fire. And Johnson walked into the presidency holding a gas can. He was a Southerner, a Democrat, a tailor's son who rose from poverty but never quite escaped the bitterness it etched into his spine. Lincoln had picked him as a show of unity, one final gamble to heal a fractured union, but Johnson wasn't interested in unity. He wanted restoration, and restoration, in his mind, meant putting white men back in charge. He called himself a friend of the common man, but Johnson's common man looked suspiciously like a former slaveholder with a hangover and a grudge. The country had just abolished slavery. The 13th Amendment was inked, ratified, barely dry. The South lay in ruins. Freedmen's schools were popping up across the war-torn states. The Freedmen's Bureau, an imperfect, overwhelmed agency, was trying to help formerly enslaved people transition into something that might resemble freedom. And Johnson hated every minute of it. He didn't just ignore the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed its funding, twice. He argued that it gave special treatment to black people, as if 400 years of bondage had been a minor inconvenience, and now the real injustice was giving them a sack of grain and a place to sleep. Congress, to its credit, overrode him. Then came the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal law defining all persons born in the United States as citizens, regardless of race. Johnson vetoed that too. He claimed it would operate in favor of the colored and against the white race. Again, Congress overrode him. It became a pattern. Reconstruction legislation would be drafted, passed, and vetoed by Johnson, then overridden by a Congress that was slowly beginning to realize the man in the White House was not a speed bump on the road to justice. He was a barricade. And yet, he stayed in power. Why? Because Johnson knew how to weaponize legality. He wasn't a demagogue like Jackson or a bureaucratic strangler like Wilson. He was a Stonewall in a three-piece suit. He didn't need vision. He had vetoes. He pardoned Confederate leaders en masse. He returned seized land to Southern aristocrats. He allowed Southern states to enact black codes, laws designed to trap freed black Americans in cycles of labor, debt, and incarceration. Under Johnson, the South didn't rebuild. It reloaded. He called it leniency, mercy, constitutional restraint, but it was cowardice wrapped in principle, cruelty dressed up as balance. Johnson didn't just fail to protect black Americans. He actively undermined every attempt to secure their rights. He wasn't neutral. He was complicit. The irony? Johnson claimed to hate the Southern elite. He branded himself as the voice of the poor white man. He raged against the planter aristocracy. But the moment they needed him, when ex-Confederates begged for clemency and power, he folded. He gave them everything. Because the only thing Johnson hated more than rich Southerners was black freedom. He thought Reconstruction was an insult to the Constitution. He thought equality was a fantasy. He believed America was a white man's republic, and he governed accordingly. In 1866, he embarked on a speaking tour, known mockingly as the Swing Around the Circle, to rally support for his policies. It backfired spectacularly. Johnson, never known for subtlety or tact, attacked Congress, praised white supremacy, and compared himself to Christ. The public recoiled. Republicans swept the midterms. By 1867, Congress was done playing nice. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, a law designed to prevent Johnson from firing certain federal officials without Senate approval. Johnson tested it immediately by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Lincoln holdover and key ally of congressional Reconstruction. That was it, the final straw. The House impeached him. 11 articles, mostly about defying the Tenure Act, but everyone knew what the trial was really about: race, power, and the moral vacuum in the White House. The Senate came within one vote of removing him. One. He survived, technically, but politically, morally, historically, Johnson was finished. He left office in disgrace. No farewell speech, no legacy tour, just a sneer and a stain on the carpet. And yet the damage was done, because Reconstruction didn't end with Johnson, but it cracked under him. He slowed it, poisoned it, gave oxygen to the white, backlash that would metastasize into Jim Crow. He was the bridge between slavery and segregation, the man who stood at the crossroads and pointed the country backward. Even now, there's debate. Was Johnson simply a product of his time? A man trying to preserve order in chaos? But that's not the mystery. The real mystery is this: how did a man so mediocre, so transparently vindictive, do so much harm? He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't cunning. He wasn't even competent. He was just stubborn. And in America, sometimes that's enough. But if you think stubbornness is the worst quality a president can bring to office, wait until the next one. A man whose own party disowned him, who burned bridges so thoroughly he had to govern alone. A man who started as a Whig and died a Confederate. John Tyler. There's a reason most Americans can't remember John Tyler. He was the president history tried to forget, and for good reason. Not because he did nothing, but because what he did was treasonous in slow motion. He was the first vice president to inherit the presidency upon a sitting president's death, and from the moment William Henry Harrison's body cooled, Tyler began doing something very un-American. He treated the Constitution like a mirror and only saw himself. He wasn't supposed to be president, not really. The Constitution didn't clearly define what happened when a president died in office. Tyler simply declared himself president, no acting, no temporary title. He took the full role, swore the oath, moved in, and dared anyone to stop him. They didn't. The cabinet objected. The press mocked him. They called him His Excellency. But Tyler didn't flinch. He fired the cabinet and started signing legislation like he'd been elected by God. He wasn't a Whig in philosophy. He had been a Democrat until the moment it became inconvenient, but he wore the Whig badge long enough to get on the ballot. Once in office, he tore it off and lit it on fire. The party that brought him into power quickly realized they'd birthed a political virus. Tyler vetoed every key plank of the Whig platform, including 2 bills to reestablish a national bank. He didn't just oppose the bank, he crushed it, Jackson style, then took a bow. His entire cabinet, except Daniel Webster, resigned in protest. Congress tried to censure him. The Whigs expelled him from the party. By midterm, he was a president with no allies, no party, no path forward. But Tyler didn't need friends. He needed a cause. And he found it in slavery. It's easy to forget because the textbooks often do. But John Tyler wasn't some moderate Southern gentleman caught in the gears of history. He was a full-throated, unapologetic defender of human bondage. He believed slavery was natural, constitutional, and necessary, and he governed accordingly. When abolitionist petitions flooded Congress, he supported the gag rule to block them. When Northern critics called for the gradual end of slavery, Tyler argued they were destroying the Union. He didn't want compromise, he wanted expansion, and that's where Texas comes in. Tyler saw Texas not just as territory, but as ideology, a slaveholder's paradise, a Southern empire. He pursued its annexation with rabid focus, even after every political calculation said not to. The Senate rejected his treaty to annex Texas. So he changed tactics, pivoted to a joint resolution, which only required a majority in both houses. A constitutional shortcut, some said. A cheap trick, others muttered. It worked. Texas joined the Union in 1845, a win for Tyler that looked, on the surface, like legacy. But beneath the ribbon-cutting and statehood ceremonies was a powder keg. Texas meant more slave territory, more political clout for the South, more tension between North and South, and inevitably war with Mexico. Tyler didn't live to see the Civil War, but he lit the fuse that would lead to it. The final irony, when the war finally did come, John Tyler made his choice quickly. He didn't waffle. He didn't try to mediate. He didn't plead for unity. He sided with the Confederacy. He chaired the Virginia Peace Convention, an effort to keep Southern states from seceding. But once secession became reality, he didn't blink. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. The former president of the United States, a man who once swore to preserve the Union, died as a traitor to it. No national mourning, no state funeral. Lincoln refused to acknowledge his death. The Union flag did not fly at half-mast. He vanished as silently as he arrived. Tyler is often left off the list of worst presidents Not because he was misunderstood, but because he was too understood. He didn't confuse the country. He didn't stumble through moral ambiguity. He was direct, calculated, and lethal to unity. In his own words, the institutions of this country are safe so long as the people are true to themselves. But Tyler was never true to the nation. He was true to power, to plantation ideology, to the Confederacy. He was the first American president to die having committed active treason. So yes, you may have forgotten John Tyler, but his fingerprints are still on the documents of disunion, the margins of the Constitution, and the borders of a fractured country. If Jackson was the general president and Wilson the academic tyrant, Tyler was something worse, a chameleon of loyalty, who cloaked betrayal in the costume of patriotism. But if you think betrayal ends at the Confederate flag, wait until you meet the next man. A modern operator, a cold warrior, a genius of paranoia who looked at democracy and asked, what if we just erase the parts we don't like? Richard Nixon. If paranoia had a patron saint, it would be Richard Milhous Nixon, a man who hated losing more than he loved winning, and who proved that you could climb to the top of American power, then tunnel beneath it just to plant a bug. Nixon wasn't born into greatness. He clawed his way up, one sweaty handshake and gritted tooth at a time. And once he made it to the Oval Office, he brought the whole siege mentality with him. He wasn't evil in the theatrical sense. No genocides, no Confederate sympathies. His evil was quieter, procedural, strategic, and so deeply embedded in the mechanisms of power that by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The mythos of Nixon is almost Shakespearean. The tragic overreach of a brilliant man undone by his own darkness. But don't let the tragedy distract you. What Nixon did wasn't a fall from grace. It was a masterclass in controlled demolition. From the inside, we all know the headline, Watergate. June 17th, 1972. 5 men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex, caught red-handed with wiretapping equipment and stacks of crisp bills. At first, it seemed like amateur hour espionage, a campaign prank gone wrong. But it wasn't a prank. It was policy. Nixon didn't order the break-in, not directly, but the operation was part of a larger machinery, an ecosystem of sabotage, surveillance, and dirty tricks designed to eliminate political threats before they could speak. The White House had a full-time plumbers unit tasked with stopping leaks. And by leaks, they meant information, truth, dissent. The goal wasn't just re-election, it was domination. Nixon kept an enemies list, names of journalists, politicians, celebrities, anyone who disagreed with him. And he didn't just glare at it, he used it. He unleashed the IRS on them. Had their phones tapped, he created a shadow government within the actual one, full of loyalists, yes men, and professional paranoiacs. And through it all, he recorded everything. Oval Office tapes, every conversation, every scheme, every muttered slur and strategy session. Nixon's hubris was so vast, he preserved his own crimes in stereo. When the Watergate story broke, Nixon lied, repeatedly, brazenly. He fired the special prosecutor investigating him. His attorney general resigned, so did his deputy, so did the next special prosecutor. It became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, a constitutional crisis disguised as HR drama. But here's the thing, Watergate wasn't the beginning. It was the end, the rotten fruit of a poisoned tree that started growing long before Nixon took the oath. He came into office in 1969 preaching unity, order, and an end to the Vietnam War. But his secret plan to end the war was, in practice, an escalation. He expanded the conflict into Cambodia and Laos, without congressional approval and without public debate. The bombings were massive, sustained, and classified. Tens of thousands died. Civilians, farmers, families vaporized under American ordnance. Nixon called it a limited incursion, a footnote in war. But for those on the ground, it was total annihilation. When protests erupted back home, he didn't listen. He labeled dissenters as traitors. At Kent State University, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4. Nixon blamed the students. He didn't stop a war. He buried it in silence. And yet he also opened China, détente with the Soviets, arms control treaties, environmental legislation. He created the EPA of all things. There was brilliance behind the curtain of bile. That's the enigma of Nixon. He did good things while being an objectively bad person. He cared deeply about global stability and not at all about democratic integrity. He craved peace abroad and wielded chaos at home. He believed the presidency was too powerful to be questioned and too fragile to be shared. In one of the infamous Oval Office recordings, Nixon muttered to his aide, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." He wasn't joking. He believed it. He believed in executive supremacy, not because he trusted the office, but because he didn't trust anyone else to hold it. That's not patriotism. That's pathology. Eventually, the walls closed in. The tapes were subpoenaed. The Supreme Court ruled against him. The Senate prepared articles of impeachment. Faced with political extinction, Nixon did what no president had ever done. He quit. August 8th, 1974. He stepped down. Gerald Ford pardoned him 1 month later. And just like that, Nixon became a private citizen again. No trial, no prison, just retirement, book deals, and the occasional awkward tribute. He spent the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his image, writing foreign policy essays, giving interviews, shaking hands with presidents who pretended not to smell the smoke, still clinging to his suit. And somehow it worked. By the time he died, some saw him as a sage, a survivor, the American Machiavelli. But that myth ignores what he truly was, a corrosive force, a man who looked at the Constitution and saw a menu, a man who used the law like a scalpel and sometimes like a shiv. He taught America that power, once seized, can be buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, plausible deniability, and patriotic jargon. And he left behind a political class that learned all the wrong lessons. But if Nixon showed us how far one man could bend the Constitution, the next president on our list showed how quickly a nation could burn it. He didn't tap phones, he launched wars. He didn't erase tapes, he erased countries. He told us history would judge him kindly, and then handed it a war it still hasn't forgiven. George W. Bush. History may remember him with a smirk. A man who couldn't pronounce nuclear, who once nearly choked on a pretzel, who painted dogs and veterans after leaving office, like trauma was something you could watercolor over. But behind the homespun flubs and folksy charm, George W. Bush presided over one of the most devastating presidencies in modern memory. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded exactly as intended. He was elected in 2000, or more accurately, selected, after a contested vote count, a controversial Supreme Court decision, and the smallest margin in American history. George W. Bush entered the White House without a clear mandate, but with absolute confidence. And for a moment, it seemed like his presidency might be forgettable. That was before the September event. The event changed everything, but not just for America. For Bush, they were a blank check, a moral license to invade, surveil, torture, and transform the country into a place where fear wasn't just a feeling, it was policy. It began in Afghanistan. Understandable, strategic. Al-Qaeda had used the country as a base. The Taliban sheltered them. The invasion felt, briefly, like justice. But then came the pivot, the real gamble, the lie. Iraq. Saddam Hussein wasn't involved in the September event. There were no weapons of mass destruction, no active nuclear program, no connection to the hijackers. But facts didn't matter. Bush's team framed the war not as vengeance, but as prevention. They spoke of mushroom clouds, yellow cake uranium, aluminum tubes. It was a sales pitch, not a strategy. And America bought it. In 2003, under the banners of freedom and liberation, the U.S. invaded Iraq. The regime fell quickly, but what followed was chaos, civil war, insurgency, sectarian violence. Thousands of American troops were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians are dead. A region destabilized for decades. An entire country reduced to sand, blood, and rubble. And for what? For oil? For pride? For the appearance of strength? The Bush administration never quite explained. But the consequences were real. The war cost trillions. It spawned terrorist groups more vicious than their predecessors, and it fractured America's credibility in ways that haven't healed. Bush stood on an aircraft carrier in 2003 under a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." The war would drag on for 8 more years, but war was just one front. At home, Another transformation was underway. The USA Patriot Act gave the government sweeping powers to spy on its own citizens. Phone calls, emails, bank records, all in the name of national security. No warrants, no transparency, just data and silence. Airports became zones of suspicion. Muslims were profiled. Dissent was labeled unpatriotic. The country became a surveillance state dressed in red, white, and blue. And then there was torture. The Bush administration called it enhanced interrogation, but that's a euphemism, like calling drowning a form of breathing. Detainees were waterboarded, beaten, sleep-deprived, stripped, shackled, and held in black sites, secret prisons outside American jurisdiction. Guantanamo Bay became a symbol not of justice, but of limbo. Men were held without trial, without evidence, without hope. Some were later found innocent. Others died waiting for charges that never came. Bush claimed the high ground, said America didn't torture, said it was saving lives, but morality doesn't come with a disclaimer. The architects of these policies, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Ashcroft, called themselves patriots, but they wrote a playbook for future autocrats, and Bush signed every page. Then came Hurricane Katrina. In 2005, the storm slammed into the Gulf Coast. The levees broke, New Orleans drowned. Over 1,800 people died. Tens of thousands were stranded, many of them poor, many of them black, and the federal government stood paralyzed, confused, detached. Bush flew over the devastation in Air Force One. The photo, him looking down from the sky, distant and untouched, became a symbol of elite indifference. The FEMA response was slow. Supplies didn't arrive. Bodies piled up in the Superdome. Bureaucracy moved at glacial speed while citizens begged for water. "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," Bush said to FEMA Director Michael Brown, whose performance was an unmitigated disaster. It wasn't just a failure of policy, it was a failure of empathy. Because when you stack up the wars, the surveillance, the torture, and the neglect, it's not just incompetence, it's ideology. It's the belief that force is clarity, that fear is utility, that the Constitution is flexible when it's inconvenient. And through it all, Bush kept smiling, kept preaching optimism, kept assuring the country it was safer than before, even as coffins came home draped in flags. He left office in 2009 with approval ratings in the basement and an economy in free fall. The housing market had collapsed. Banks were bleeding. Wall Street had gambled and lost. The country spiraled into the worst recession since the Great Depression. And yet, in the years that followed, Bush's image softened. He gave Michelle Obama candy at funerals. He painted portraits. He made jokes. Some began calling him harmless, even adorable. But make no mistake, the wreckage of his decisions still litters the world. ISIS emerged from the power vacuum in Iraq. Surveillance infrastructure became standard policy. Guantanamo is still open, and the legal justifications for torture are still sitting in law school footnotes, waiting for someone cruel enough to dust them off. The mystery of George W. Bush isn't whether he meant well. It's how easily good intentions can lead to evil outcomes when no one stops to ask, what are we actually doing? Because the road to hell isn't just paved with intentions. It's paved with executive orders, classified memos, and bipartisan applause. And if Bush lit the match on global instability, the next president detonated a bomb designed to end a world war and started a whole new kind of one. Harry Truman. Harry S. Truman had a middle initial that stood for nothing. That wasn't just symbolic, it was prophetic. Because when you peel back the layers of mythology, the tidy biographies, and the fawning nostalgia for the ordinary man who did extraordinary things, what you find isn't a simple truth. You find a void. A president who dropped the atomic bomb twice. A man who ended one war by creating a weapon so terrifying it made the very concept of war feel like a suicide note. And who, in the same breath, opened the door to the Cold War, a conflict that would haunt the world for the next half-century. But let's not start with the mushroom clouds. Let's start with the man. Truman was a haberdasher, a small-town Missouri senator. He came to the vice presidency by political accident, elevated in 1944 not for brilliance, but for balance. The Democratic Party needed someone manageable, moderate, and unobjectionable to replace Henry Wallace on the ticket. Truman fit the bill. He was safe, quiet, reliable. Then, less than 3 months into his vice presidency, Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and Truman was handed the most powerful job on earth with almost no preparation. He hadn't been briefed on the Manhattan Project. He didn't know America was developing a bomb that could liquefy cities. When they told him, his first instinct wasn't horror. It was curiosity. The war in Europe was winding down. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. But Japan was still fighting. The Pacific Theater was brutal. Bloody island hopping, kamikaze pilots, cities reduced to rubble. The invasion of the Japanese mainland, military planners warned, could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. So Truman was presented with a new option. Not a weapon, a threat. The atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The city was vaporized. Over 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 died in the following weeks from burns, radiation, and trauma. The survivors were barely human anymore. Skin hanging in sheets, eyes melted, mouths locked in silent screams. 3 days later, it happened again. Nagasaki, Fat Man, another 40,000 killed instantly. More to come. Truman claimed the bombings were necessary, that they saved lives, that they ended the war. But even then, voices inside his own administration questioned it. Japan was already on the verge of surrender. The Soviet Union had just declared war. Would a blockade have worked? A demonstration on an uninhabited island? We'll never know, because Truman never waited. In his statement after Hiroshima, he called the weapon the greatest achievement of organized science in history. He said it would shorten the war and save lives. Not a single word about the victims. No mention of civilians. Just progress. Then he went to lunch. Truman's defenders argue he had no good options, that he made a brutal choice in a brutal war. And maybe that's true. But here's the problem. He didn't stop there. Truman didn't just end one war. He launched another, a slow, cold, paranoid war that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War wasn't a side effect of victory. It was part of the plan. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, promised American support for any country resisting communism. That meant money, weapons, influence, and, when necessary, coups. It was the blueprint for interventionism, a blank check for anti-communist regimes, no matter how violent or corrupt. Greece, Turkey, Iran, Guatemala. The list began. Then came the Marshall Plan, economic aid for Europe. Noble on the surface, but strategic at the core. The goal wasn't just recovery, it was containment. Keep Europe stable, keep communism out, make America indispensable. And thus the New World Order was born. East versus West, democracy versus communism, freedom versus tyranny. At least on paper. In reality, it meant proxy wars, payback dictatorships, civilian casualties dressed up as collateral damage, all justified by one looming specter, the Soviet Union. Truman oversaw the creation of the National Security Council, the CIA, the NSA, an entire shadow architecture of surveillance and secrecy. He created the military-industrial complex before Eisenhower gave it a name. Then came Korea. In 1950, the North invaded the South. Truman sent troops. Not a declaration of war, just a police action. A euphemism with a body count. The Korean War was brutal, grinding, and ultimately unresolved. Millions of civilians died. Seoul changed hands 4 times. American forces pushed too far north, prompting Chinese intervention. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, right where it started, but the cost was staggering. Truman's presidency, which began in 1945, ended in stalemate. He left office in 1953 with an approval rating below 30%, reviled, mocked, dismissed as over his head, and yet in time he was rebranded. The underdog, the accidental president who did what had to be done. He got a library, a miniseries, a comeback. But here's the riddle no one likes to answer. If dropping a nuclear bomb on civilians is justified once, what stops it from happening again? Truman crossed a line no one had crossed before. And because he was never punished, never even seriously questioned, every president after him got a little bolder, a little less cautious, a little more willing to use death as diplomacy. He made the unthinkable thinkable. And so we live in a world still shaped by his choices. The bomb became doctrine. The Cold War became reflex. Intervention became instinct. Truman didn't just change America. He changed reality. And if Truman made mass destruction feel acceptable, the next man showed how inaction, passive, quiet, and seemingly benign, can still leave a country bleeding from the inside. A man who didn't start the Civil War, but who did absolutely nothing to stop it. James Buchanan. James Buchanan had one job: not to fix the country, not to heal its divisions, just to keep it from collapsing long enough to hand it off to the next guy in one piece. He failed, spectacularly. When historians rank the worst presidents in American history, Buchanan doesn't just make the list. He often tops it, not because he committed a single grand atrocity, but because he stood on the edge of the abyss, watched the nation split apart, and decided the best course of action was to straighten his cuffs and do absolutely nothing. If Andrew Johnson tried to bury Reconstruction and Tyler quietly shifted toward the Confederacy, Buchanan held the door open for secession, offered them tea, and blamed abolitionists for the broken furniture. He entered office in 1857, already steeped in compromise, ambiguity, and the scent of Southern boot polish. A Democrat from Pennsylvania with strong Southern sympathies, Buchanan was one of the few Northerners Southerners could trust, because he'd spent his entire political life proving just how far he'd bend to keep the slave states happy. His presidential campaign had promised stability, unity, a calm hand on the wheel. What America got was the political equivalent of a man falling asleep while steering toward a cliff. Let's start with his crowning disgrace, the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no legal standing to sue in federal court. It also declared that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in U.S. territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise and opening every inch of federal land to potential slavery. It was a legal earthquake, and Buchanan, instead of responding with shock or moral concern, cheered it on, quietly then openly. In fact, he had advanced knowledge of the ruling before it was issued. He had lobbied justices from behind the scenes to vote in favor of the Southern interpretation. This wasn't just passive endorsement, it was collusion. A sitting president using the judiciary to smuggle pro-slavery doctrine into national law. He called the decision a final settlement, said it would forever put to rest the slavery issue. Instead, it poured gasoline on a nation already smoldering. Then came Bleeding Kansas, a violent proxy war over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free or slave state. Buchanan supported the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, despite the fact that it was riddled with fraud and opposed by the majority of Kansas settlers. So Congress revolted, so did Northern Democrats. Buchanan doubled down. He sent federal troops to enforce the fraudulent Constitution. The result, more violence, more blood, and a fractured Democratic Party, one that would collapse entirely by the time Lincoln arrived. Throughout his term, Buchanan insisted he was simply following the Constitution, that the federal government had no right to interfere in the affairs of states or territories, that slavery was a question for the people to decide. But what he really meant was he didn't want to anger the South. And so, inch by inch, he legitimized the illegitimate. He treated secessionist rhetoric as a reasonable political position. He refused to challenge Southern aggression, even as militias formed, arsenals were seized, and threats of disunion turned into promises. By the time Lincoln was elected in 1860, the powder keg had a lit fuse. South Carolina seceded that December. Other states followed. Buchanan's response? He said secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop it. A paradox so perfect it would be funny if it hadn't killed 600,000 Americans. He sent no troops. He took no meaningful action. He blamed the North for the tension. He told Congress, in essence, this is someone else's problem. He spent his final months in office passively narrating the country's disintegration, like a court stenographer to national suicide. And then finally, mercifully, he left. Lincoln inherited a nation already in flames, a military in disarray, an executive branch gutted by inaction and cowardice. Buchanan waved him in, smiled for the cameras, and retreated to a quiet life, where he defended his presidency until the day he died. He wrote memoirs. He claimed history would vindicate him. He said the real villains were the abolitionists for agitating the South and creating the climate for disunion. Even in retirement, he was incapable of admitting the obvious, that his moral neutrality in the face of evil was evil. The mystery of Buchanan isn't whether he failed. That much is clear. The mystery is whether he wanted to succeed. He wasn't incompetent in the traditional sense. He was intelligent, experienced, a former Secretary of State, a seasoned diplomat, but he treated slavery as a political inconvenience, not a moral crisis. He treated secession as a tantrum, not treason. And in doing so, he paved the road to war with polished boots and polite language. He didn't start the Civil War, but he made damn sure it had a running start. And if Buchanan let the country fall apart through passivity, the next man on our list took a more hands-on approach. He wrapped imperialism in prayer, drew borders in ink and blood, and called conquest a public service. He didn't just acquire territory. He bought himself a war and a legacy soaked in colonial guilt. William McKinley. If empire had a smile, it looked like William McKinley. He didn't rant. He didn't rave. He wasn't a brawler like Jackson or a backroom fixer like Nixon. McKinley was soft-spoken, mild-mannered, and devoutly religious. He looked more like a church treasurer than a global conqueror, but under that calm exterior was a quiet moral absolutism and an appetite for expansion dressed up as salvation. He came to power in 1897 on a wave of Republican prosperity talk, gold standards, protective tariffs, and American industry as the path to greatness. His platform was business-friendly, God-approved, and suspiciously vague about foreign policy. But that changed quickly, because Spain was holding on to its last scraps of empire, and the U.S. smelled opportunity. Enter Cuba. The island was in revolt. Spanish forces were brutalizing civilians. Newspapers in the U.S., particularly Hearst and Pulitzer's empires, peddled lurid tales of Spanish atrocities, often exaggerated or fabricated. The American public was whipped into a frenzy, not over freedom but vengeance, and McKinley, always careful, always calculating, eventually relented. In 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the war cry. The cause was unclear, it still is, but clarity wasn't needed. McKinley asked Congress for war. They gave it. The Spanish-American War lasted just 10 weeks. It was, on the surface, a quick, clean victory. Spain collapsed. The U.S. seized control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and, most notably, the Philippines. And that's when things got ugly. The U.S. promised the Filipinos liberation, promised them freedom from colonial rule, but McKinley had different plans. He later claimed that he prayed to Almighty God for guidance and decided the U.S. had to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. The problem? They were already mostly Christian. They just weren't American. When the Filipinos realized the U.S. had no intention of granting independence, they resisted. Thus began the Philippine-American War, a brutal, bloody conflict that lasted for years and killed hundreds of thousands. Civilians were rounded up in concentration camps. Entire villages were torched. Waterboarding, then known as the water cure, was routine. One U.S. general ordered his troops to kill anyone over the age of 10. He called it civilizing. McKinley never saw a battlefield, but he signed every deployment, justified every atrocity. He didn't see imperialism. He saw destiny, the manifest variety. Meanwhile, back home, McKinley was busy making life easier for corporations. He passed the Dingley Tariff, the highest in U.S. history, shielding American industry from foreign competition. He argued it protected workers, but it mainly protected monopolies. Laborers suffered, prices rose, but the stock market smiled. And so did McKinley. He was a master of contradiction, a deeply religious man who sent missionaries with rifles, a populist who cozied up to industrial barons, a peacekeeper who waged undeclared wars. Even his public persona was an illusion. He seemed gentle, but his administration used the military and federal law to crush labor strikes and suppress dissent. He cracked down on anti-imperialist voices. He painted conquest as benevolence, and America believed it. By 1900, McKinley had turned the United States into an empire, and most voters didn't seem to mind. He won re-election in a landslide with Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate. The war was over. The economy was booming. The flag flew over more territory than ever before. And then, in 1901, while shaking hands at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was shot by an anarchist. He died days later. The empire lived on. Roosevelt took the reins and expanded it further. The Philippines weren't granted full independence until 1946. After World War II, Cuba became a puppet. Puerto Rico still isn't a state. McKinley's legacy is quieter than it should be. There are statues, of course, schools named after him, but little national reckoning. Because Americans are comfortable with success stories, even if they're written in someone else's blood. He didn't scream. He didn't strut. He didn't rant about race or vengeance or power. He just whispered about duty and then bombed you until you agreed. That's the puzzle of McKinley. He turned colonialism into a sermon, made imperial war sound like charity, and left behind a country that still doesn't know how to tell the difference. But if McKinley proved that evil could be polite, the next man proved it could be drunk, grieving, and hiding behind a shaky smile, while signing away the soul of a nation one compromise at a time. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce drank to forget. America drank to forget him. The 14th president of the United States is often remembered, when he's remembered at all, as a footnote, a tragic figure, a shadowy precursor to the Civil War, a man so nondescript that even his scandals feel like whispers. But the truth is simpler, darker, and more enduring. Pierce didn't just fail to prevent the Civil War. He greased the wheels. He wasn't evil in the obvious, performative way. He didn't burn cities or bomb nations. He didn't scream about loyalty or betrayal. He didn't need to. His weapon was policy. His ammunition was apathy. And his greatest crime was knowing exactly what was coming and choosing to make it worse. Born in New Hampshire, Pierce was a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, a dough-face they called men like him. Soft on slavery, sympathetic to the slave-holding South despite never owning a slave himself. He wanted desperately to hold the Union together, and he thought the best way to do that was to give the South everything it asked for. Spoiler, it didn't work. Pierce entered office in 1853 riding a tidal wave of personal tragedy. Just weeks before his inauguration, he and his wife were on a train when it derailed. Their 11-year-old son, Benjamin, was thrown from the car and decapitated before their eyes. It was their last surviving child. Pierce reportedly never recovered. His wife retreated into grief. He retreated into a bottle. He was sworn in, pale and hollow-eyed, without much of a plan and even less of a backbone. But he had friends in Southern high places. And he had a goal: preserve the Union by appeasing the loudest voices in the room. Unfortunately, those voices belonged to slavers. The central moral collapse of Pierce's presidency came in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was designed to solve the problem of expanding slavery into new territories. Previously, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line in the sand. Literally, slavery was prohibited north of latitude 36 degrees, 30 minutes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was working. Pierce threw it in the fireplace. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Popular sovereignty, they called it. Democracy in action. Except, of course, it wasn't democracy. It was a Molotov cocktail in legislative form. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces rushed into Kansas like a gold rush, armed and furious. The result? Violence, election fraud, political chaos, towns burned, citizens murdered. A mini civil war in the heartland. Bleeding Kansas, it was called, a name soaked in the blood of Pierce's compromise. Pierce's response? He backed the pro-slavery government, even though it had been installed through blatant fraud and intimidation. He sent federal troops to support them. He ignored the anti-slavery voices crying out for recognition and protection. He didn't just sit on the sidelines, he picked a side, and he picked wrong. The nation watched Kansas tear itself apart, and Pierce smiled blandly through it. He said it was democracy, but what he really meant was, let the strong win. The South saw a green light, the North saw betrayal, and the fragile union that Pierce claimed to protect cracked further down the middle. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act wasn't his only sin. Pierce also enforced the Fugitive Slave Act with zeal. This law allowed Southern slave catchers to pursue escaped slaves into northern states and drag them back into bondage with little more than a claim and a nod from a sympathetic judge. It deputized regular citizens. It fined anyone who refused to help. It turned every free state into a hunting ground. Pierce didn't just support the act. He made sure it was enforced with vigor. When abolitionists protested, he called them radicals. When states resisted, he sent in federal marshals. He said he was preserving the Constitution, but what he was really doing was preserving white comfort, the comfort of not choosing a side, of pretending slavery was a legal technicality, not a moral rot. Then there was the Ostend Manifesto. This little gem, written by American diplomats under Pierce's watch, proposed that the U.S. should buy Cuba from Spain. And if Spain refused, the U.S. should take it by force. Why Cuba? Because it was a potential slave state, a way to expand the Southern Empire. When the manifesto leaked, it ignited outrage. Northern critics saw it as proof that Pierce's administration was in the pocket of the slaveocracy, that America was no longer hiding its imperial ambitions, it was shouting them. Pierce disavowed the manifesto, but only after the damage was done. His administration's fingerprints were all over it, and the message was clear. This president would do anything to placate the South, even risk war with a European power. By the end of his term, Pierce was so politically radioactive that his own party refused to renominate him. He left office in disgrace, watched from the sidelines as his compromises unraveled into full-blown collapse, and spent the rest of his life in a haze of obscurity and alcohol. When Lincoln was assassinated, Pierce didn't mourn publicly. His silence was noted. When asked how he felt about his legacy, Pierce reportedly said, "There's nothing left to do but drink." Maybe. But history isn't as forgiving as whiskey, and Pierce's legacy remains. A man who watched the nation splinter and poured oil on the cracks, who pretended compromise was virtue when it was just cowardice in a cravat. He didn't take a side in the moral crisis of his time. He took cover. And so we arrive at the end of our list. 10 men, 10 presidencies, 10 reminders that power doesn't require malice to become dangerous, just cowardice, calculation, and the right excuse. They didn't all wear the mask of evil. Some wore crosses, some wore smiles, some wore nothing at all. And maybe that's the most American mystery of all. Not who was the most evil, but how many of them we still call great.